Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. Here at the museum we tell the story of the British Army and the people who served in it, from the Civil Wars to the present day, through our galleries, collections, programmes and research. There are many ways to support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Anne-Marie Foster. Anne-Marie is a historian of modern Britain with expertise in the First World War, ephemera and museums. She's a Chancellor's Fellow at Robert Gordon University and is leading the project Accessible Past, Equitable Futures at the Imperial War Museums. Today, she will be discussing the relationship between museums, their objects, and war. There will be a chance to ask questions at the end, so when the time comes, put your hand up. I'll bring the microphone round to you. If you're online, we have our chat function for you to ask questions and our Q&A section. Just any technical points, if your stream freezes, we recommend you refresh. That usually cures all ills. Or there'll be a member of staff in the chat box to answer any questions should you have them. With that all said, I will now pass over to Anne-Marie and hope you enjoy the talk.
Right, good afternoon everybody, both in the room and online. I've been told that if I look that way, I'll get the camera over there. And thank you for giving up this lunch hour, especially because it's such beautiful weather today. So, in 1988, a man donated his great-uncle's First World War baton to a regimental museum in the northeast of England. He and the curator had been sending letters back and forth for some time, as all the man had were war stories, and I quote, based on hearsay from older relatives. He thought his great-uncle had died in a prisoner of war camp, and the curator of the collection spent some time trying to find out more information about this and replied, telling him a little bit more about his great-uncle's histories. Reflecting on the act of donation and what it meant to him, the soldier's great-nephew eventually kind of wrote to the curator saying, "I think I've done my best to honour the memory of my great-uncle. His walking cane will lie in the museum on the 70th anniversary of his death." For the great-nephew, this was the pinnacle of what he could do for his ancestor, placing a family memento into a museum he felt would honour his memory. So today, I'm going to talk to you about how and why family objects end up in such places as this. We're going to look at a range of, snapshots, really, which show people's motivations for donating family items to museums. We'll think about what motivates people to do this, how their decisions were influenced by external factors, and question what uncovering these histories does, right? Why am I interested and why are we thinking about this? In short, what understandings can we get when we start looking at people's donations and the paperwork that accompanies them? Now, people in this room or online may well have first-hand experience of this, through you or a relation donating an item to, again, a local, regimental, national museum, or possibly even finding out that somebody else in your family has done that on your behalf. You may well have engaged with some of the online collections of war items that were popular during the centenary and that we'll talk about in about half an hour or so. Or you might have absolutely no connection to this topic at all, or indeed professional experience of acquiring items for a collection. And today we're going to be thinking this through mostly through the lens of the First World War, partially because that's my background as a historian. My work is about comparative mass death events in the early 20th century, so mostly war and disaster, but also because the First World War leads to this watershed in what museums do and how they relate to the public. So it was during and after the First World War that museums connected with their audiences through asking them to donate material, doing this at scale, both nationally and internationally. So we'll be looking at how families engage with museums by donating items during three key moments over the last century. We'll be looking at 1917 and into the early 1920s, so that first wave, the 70s and 80s, which are quite a big second wave, and then, of course, the centenary of the war, 2014 to 18. I was about to say the wrong dates there, which would be embarrassing. I will say very briefly before we continue, some of the material that we're talking about today, it's memorial items, and they do relate to a soldier's death. So there'll be a little bit of mourning material. If this talk isn't for you today, do feel free to step out at any point. So, let's talk about the First World War. It was a remarkably well-documented war while it was still ongoing. In the early years of the war, officials and curators recognized that they should document the conflict. And during the latter half of the war in particular, there was a frenzy of collecting because they realized that actually in 1914 to 1915, not enough had been collected. So the Canadian War Records Office, based in London, was a particularly prolific collector and displayer of early wartime memorabilia. War relics, or items from the front, were of particular significance as objects that had in some ways witnessed war. Public exhibitions often included items that had been captured to boost public morale. And there was a kind of collection economy, really, that circulated from the battlefields of France over the Channel. And actually, that still exists if any of us have been to the Eurostar in France, which tells you to not bring shrapnel back. So concerted efforts to collect wartime items were also made outside of London. So a Cambridge University librarian, Francis Jenkinson, who was approaching sort of retirement when the war broke out, so he was too old to be on active service, was instrumental in creating what's known as the War Reserve Collection at the university. From 1915, Jenkinson dedicated a significant portion of his time to collecting First World War publications and ephemera for the library. And he did so in increasingly tenacious ways. So Jenkinson wrote to various people, including public offices, men on fighting fronts and sympathetic neutrals around the globe, begging them to send printed items for his collection. He pursued announcements and letters in the press, which might lead to an interesting donation of ephemera. For example, in 1916, he wrote to Colonel Collett of the Gloucester Rifles, saying, "I see in the Morning Post reference to the 5th Gloucester Gazette," which is just a trench journal, "and your name is mentioned. I am making great efforts to get together a war collection for this library. I have a certain number of trench magazines, etc. But I do not have this. Can you help me get a set? So many of these publications will disappear after the war that copies ought to be housed in a few safe places." So keen was he to grow the collection that Jenkinson befriended many of the men training for a commission at Trinity College, and I quote, "eager to interest them in his wartime collection." So all of this is taking place very much in an active moment where people realise that first-hand material is very important. National collections were also taken very seriously by the government, who consolidated its involvement in collecting items from the First World War through the creation of the National War Museum in 1917, which was rapidly renamed the Imperial War Museum. The museum directorate attempted to establish representative and widespread collections before items were lost in war. And this is just one of their very, very early exhibitions that you can see. This was the munitions room, and I think that you can kind of already see from the assortment of stuff on the tables and the images around that they were very, very broad in their collections. But the two collections I want to talk to you today, that kind of took place during this time, were the Bond of Sacrifice and the Women's Work collections, which were contemporary collection drives which encouraged the families of the dead to submit photographs of the deceased, accompanied by short biographies, to the Imperial War Museum. The Bond of Sacrifice concentrated on collecting the images of men who died in the war, originally requesting photographs of only officers who died before rapidly expanding to include all men who died on active service in the armed forces. The Women's Work collection, which you can see, again, a very early display of here, was a very broad collection of items that covered the experience of women who did some form of war work. But the section of this particular kind of archive that we're interested in today is the collection of information about women who died doing war work, mostly through nursing or through munitions accidents, and we'll talk about that in a second. So the two collections were advertised very differently. And while the Bond of Sacrifice donors were generally self-selecting, they volunteered to send in this information, the Women's Work collection benefited from the work of women who tracked down the families of those who died. And the collection is very much a testament to their tenacity in a different way. So both collections were established in 1917 and actively collected until the early 1920s, sort of 21, 22, depending on when we kind of finally end the dates. So within 3 months of Imperial War Museum's approval, the Bond of Sacrifice collection, there were notices in the newspapers requesting donations of soldiers' photographs. And between 1917 and 1921, the Bond of Sacrifice amassed a response of 15,000 photographs, and about 3,000 letters that accompanied them. The Women's Work Subcommittee was formed in 1917 with members of kind of prominent wartime families at the helm. So we've got Lady Dorothy Maud Haig and Lady Ellen Asquith. And their aim was to kind of create this, like I say, record of women's war work, but to kind of collect items that would be later exhibited by the museum. And they took their memorial duty very seriously, and from about 1918 began to gather the images of women who'd lost their lives. The bond of sacrifice was in part shaped by public perceptions of what the Imperial War Museum should be collecting. It was originally intended to commemorate all the officers who fought, dead or alive, but the focus of the collection within about a month rapidly shifted from recording the images of officers to providing a repository of information about those who did not survive the war, as people increasingly just sent in images of the dead across all military ranks. So in July 1917, the Daily Mail posted an article about the Roll for Heroes, stating the collection's intent, and I quote, "The name of every man killed in the war will appear on bronze tablets in the National War Museum." You can kind of tell this was very early on in their history. Photographs of every officer decorated or killed are being sought and will be included in the collections. A year later, the museum emphasised the role of families in helping with this effort, with the museum director Martin Conway urging individuals that, and I quote, "It is only by the cooperation of relatives that our end can be attained." And families very much engaged with this collection and sent in items in a way that made sense to them. So, for example, some portraits were sent to the Bond of Sacrifice at very poignant times of the year. F.J. Gould sent his son's photograph on a particularly significant date, explaining today is the anniversary of our son's death near Arras, and we have a sad pleasure in giving his pictures to those who can appreciate it. Others sent a photograph of their loved one on Armistice Day, presumably to, in some way, symbolically mark the end of their own war experience. And there's a beautiful collection of letters sent back by the curator, marked on the 11th of November, 1918, because he himself had also lost a son in the war. So it was very much two bereaved parents talking to each other on a very, very poignant day. So families were only asked to actually send in a photograph with some brief biographical details, such as name, regiment, and a very succinct description of how they died. However, many families sent in a lot more information than this, or tried to sketch out their loved one's personality in the letters that accompanied all of these photographs. Joseph Sullivan, for example, wrote that his son was an exceptionally good and wise boy, and our only child, liked and respected by all who knew him. Then early and in childhood, he gave indications of a remarkable disposition and talent that astonished me, his father, but I attribute that to his mother's side, for she certainly looked after him assiduously. So people also explain what having a loved one's image in the collection meant to them. Bessie Smith donated photographs of two soldiers together, explaining it is the wish of BSM West's family and mine that these photographs should be placed together, if possible. And we would consider it a very great favour if you could see to this for us, as they were both very old friends and were both killed near Arras and buried near each other. It was also very clear that people talked about this collection and spread the news orally, with one woman writing that a friend of mine who sent in her husband's photograph was the reason for her sending one of her own. So in contrast to this kind of very public collection of memorial works, we have the Women's Work collection instead, where the secretary, Agnes Conway, who was the daughter of director of the museum, Martin Conway, deliberately wrote to the individual families of those who died. Now, we don't have exact numbers of women who died in the First World War doing war work. However, we can estimate that it's over 1,000. By the time we've added up, we've got about 600 nurses at a bare minimum, and we've got roughly at least 400 women doing munitions work. So I would say 1,000 upwards. As Dinah Bamber, a bereaved mother, explained, we have 4 sons serving their king and country, not having thought our youngest daughter should be taken first. And this is very much one of the hidden histories that I wanted to bring your attention to today, because we don't often get a chance to hear from the people of women, the families of women who died. So the standard letter sent to the next of kin, emphasising the women's sacrifice, very much mirrored language used about their male counterparts. And I will read this all out to you so you can kind of get a sense of this, because you wouldn't necessarily know that this was about women, I don't think, if you were hearing it for the first time. So they would write to the family saying, the committee of the Imperial War Museum is anxious to adequately commemorate the splendid service rendered by women during the war, and with this end in view is hoping to form a complete collection of portraits of women who had laid down their lives while working for their country. The committee would greatly appreciate the gift of a portrait of, they would insert the name here, to place in this collection. It will be kept for all time in the Imperial War Museum and should preferably be cabinet size, unmounted and printed by some sort of permanent process. The photograph should bear the name, date and manner of death on the back. So again, deliberately mirroring what people are asking the men to submit. And of course, similar to the Bond of Sacrifice collection, families involved in the women's work collection were highly gratified by Conway's attempt to collect photographs of the dead. One mother wrote to Conway expressing her thanks for requesting a photograph of her daughter, Florence Buckley, writing, "I am glad that her portrait will be among those noble women who gave their lives for their country." We also get one glimpse through this collection of a widower, which is, again, a voice we very, very rarely hear. So Harry Butler, a widower, wrote to Conway expressing his thanks for requesting a photograph of his wife, commenting, "I take it as a great compliment in your wishing for one." A letter from B. Smith framed the collection in a slightly different light again, couching it as a recognisable service performed for bereaved families, and one which the museum, as a place of national memory, could perform by saying, "Our beautiful girls, with their merry, helpful ways, are such a miss from the homes that we greatly appreciate, as mothers, this much compensation for our loss." Both collections were originally intended to be displayed for the public once the museum opened. However, only the Women's Work Memorial Collection actually achieved this aim. By the time Imperial War Museum first opened its doors in its temporary home of Crystal Palace in 1920, it was very obvious to the curators, at least, that the Bond of Sacrifice images would never publicly be shown because there were simply too many. They explained this in letters sent to those who inquired why the items were not on view. And families were told that owing to the enormous number of photographs received, it was found impossible to show them to the public. They are at present, however, carefully filed and catalogued so that any individual copy can be shown if required. By this means, a more or less permanent record can be kept, as if the photographs were exposed to the light, of course, they would rapidly deteriorate. The donors were, understandably, not very impressed with this. So after visiting Crystal Palace, Elle Green informed the curators that she was disappointed to find, when visiting the War Museum, that there were no photos of any of the soldiers who had given their lives, nor any mementos of them individually. I understood that there were lots shown, and my own son photographs sent for that purpose. E.A. Tickle wrote a rather scathing letter to the curators explaining, "I do not want to feel that he is just put to one side. I'm sure you will quite understand my meaning. It's a mother's sacred love for her dear one, and I should like to feel that I can tell my friends that he is there with all his comrades." A few donors hinted that they realised the real reason why the images would never be shown. With over 15,000 photographs, this sense of scale from an emotional as well as a practical point of view was simply too large a reminder of loss immediately after the war. And the images are still stored in the museum, and some have been digitised in the centenary. But they've never been publicly shown as a large collection. But although the Bond of Sacrifice photographs were never shown, the donated photographs of the women who died were. So in 1918, images of the dead were featured as part of the Women's Work exhibition hosted by Whitechapel Art Gallery. And you can see some of them here, displayed on a shrine, surrounded by candles with flags above them. And this continued when the Imperial War Museum kind of moved to Crystal Palace in 1920, and you can just, can't see them brilliantly, but through the kind of door onto the kind of quotation saying they lost their lovely youth, you can sort of see a book in a shadowed recess. And this is the only image we have of them on display at Crystal Palace. But the women's work photographs were kind of taken down from their kind of shrine-like position, placed in memorial books, and then displayed for people to flick through. However, the memorial books proved so popular that all of the images started to deteriorate because so many people had touched them and touched their pages. So the Women's Work Committee had to write to a lot of the families who'd already donated a photograph, asking them to provide another. And sadly, I think this did directly influence how people expected to one day find the display of men's images. So E.A. Tickle again asked why the photographs of men, or if the photographs of the men might perhaps have been put in large books for folks to see. So I think it's very clear that he'd gone and visited this and then not been able to find that equivalent. However, while the images were not always shown, the very act of donating a photograph of the dead to a national museum was of great significance to the families of the deceased. And this sense of the museum as a memorial site came into sharp relief again in the 70s and 80s, flanked by these two images. But it was kind of during these decades that veterans and the siblings of those who died in the war began to pass away. So during these decades, a very powerful memory transmission took place as those with a sort of lived history of the First World War died, leaving the next generation to continue family memory practices and leaving broader understandings of the war in their stead. Significantly, although this was an important even period for memory transmission, it was thought that there was very little popular engagement with the First World War in the 70s and 80s. So after the very high interest in the 60s, with, of course, Oh, What a Lovely War, we've got the BBC's Great War TV show, and before renewed popularity in the very early 90s with Blackadder Goes Forth, as well as things like Birdsong and Pat Barker's Regeneration trilogy, the 70s and 80s saw books on the subject go unsold, and decreasing attendance at cenotaph commemorations on Remembrance Sunday. So behind this apparent public disinterest was nonetheless a very key moment in the development of First World War museum collections. And here I'm going to mentally transport us away from London, and we're going to be heading up north to the Durham Light Infantry Museum to think about why these decades were of significance for donors, using a graph. Pie chart, actually, not a graph, is it? But first, some figures. So if we look at the donations of First World War memorabilia to the DLI over kind of a 20-year period, a few patterns start to emerge. First, the vast majority of donors were men, and mostly local men, which I think is maybe not surprising. People donated a wide range of materials. Approximately a third of the items were paper-based, so we've got letters, maps, diaries, and photographs. A further third of donations were of medals. Memorials, surprisingly, actually comprised about 20% of the donations during this 20-year period. And the remaining 20% was completely miscellaneous, so we had things from tack biscuits to hairbrushes. About 11% of the items were donated by veterans themselves, with a 30% donated by the wife or sibling of a First World War veteran. Sons, daughters, nieces, and nephews accounted for a further sort of 36% of the donations. But that's not what I'm interested in, really. As before, people wrote letters to the curators telling them exactly how much the act of being able to donate meant to them, or simply kind of why they were doing it. And some of them were quite blunt, and I particularly like these two. So one veteran wrote alongside their donation explaining, "I'm just the wrong side of 80 years and want to try and settle up." Another, who donated a set of wire breakers, reflected that he was delighted that they had finally got a good home before being lost when he was left behind. Family members had a slightly different relationship with the museum. They were much more cautious, they weren't as sure that the museum would want their family items, and they tended to approach in a much more deferential way. They had less of a pre-existing relationship with the regiment and therefore the museum. So one man, for example, who was too young to have fought but old enough to have memories of the war, donated his brother's next of kin memorial plaque. That's a plaque sent by the government for somebody who'd passed away, stating, "I have taken care of the plaque since my parents' death some years ago and have looked well after it. My problem is that my wife and I have no children to follow us in caring for it, and our younger relatives do not wish to take over the care of it. Please forgive me for taking up your time, but if you have a good home for the plaque, I would really appreciate it." And as with the earlier collections, the timings of donations were very important to family members. The first one that we saw kind of from 1988 was deliberately supposed to be on the anniversary of a death. Another woman tried to donate a family archive of her uncle by his presumed death. However, she did not achieve the same, as her cousin, who owned half of the family archive, wouldn't give it over to the museum. So we ended up here she ended up here, I suppose, with a split family archive where half of it is now within a regimental museum and half of it was in the family. And I suspect that this will be very familiar to some of you. So people also donated family heirlooms as a point of protest against an emergent cultural memory of the First World War. So by this point, the dominant cultural memory, so this is the kind of broad thing that members of the public, this is what they would tell you if you stopped them on the street, sort of thing. It was one that was full of pathos, of unwilling but brave soldiers fighting a war governed by incompetent generals, of course, lions led by donkeys. And the items donated did, not always, but could reveal a countercultural sort of testimony from family members which fought against this. They did not want to kind of think that people were believing that their ancestors were fools. So in the 1980s, a woman donated some of her brother's objects. And her brother had died during the Battle of the Somme, and she wanted to donate them to an institution that she thought would honour his memory. She explained to the curator of the collection that she had had the option to donate his memorabilia to a technical college a few years previously. However, she had refused because so many of these lecturers are against war for any cause and use any records to denigrate bravery and talk about jingoism that I did not respond. My brother's one desire was to go to the front and fight for freedom, like so many of his generation. They were all idealists. It makes me very sad when suggestions are made for doing away with Remembrance Sunday. So for her, a regimental museum was a place that would kind of hold alive the reasons that her brother had gone to war and understand the complex emotions she held as somebody who had lost a family member to a war that was publicly seen as largely pointless and endlessly tragic. However, while people placed these objects into repositories that they thought would kind of keep this individual memory of the dead alive, without family histories attached, you know, when we see these things displayed in museums, we don't see the family letters with them, do we? We see them kind of on their own and out of that immediate familial context. So without these attached, this kind of homogenous view of the war dead continued to dominate, and individual family histories were kind of subsumed by this very broad understanding of what the First World War meant in public. And as we enter into this kind of final section, I want us all to think quite critically about whose family histories are present and whose are perhaps still hidden within museum collections, because some of this stuff starts to throw things into kind of quite stark contrast. So by the centenary of the First World War, public memory of the war was, as I say, relatively fixed. And this is, you know, your man on the street. This is somebody who has maybe not got an interest in history, or, you know, this is kind of what we think at a very broad cultural level. So there was an extreme interest in family histories of the war throughout the centenary. And at the start of the 4-year period, historians of the First World War predicted that family memories of the conflict would, of course, fuel British national engagement with wider public centenary efforts. The then UK Prime Minister, David Cameron, suggested that family memories would be a key way for us to engage with the memory of war. However, as I say, the cultural memory of war is kind of one which has dominated people's ideas of what it meant for their ancestors to participate in the conflict. And historians have argued that by the kind of early 2000s, and again leading into the centenary, the family memory of the First World War in particular has been dominated by what are a minority of families whose soldier ancestors met a tragic end. As we know, most people came back from the war. And for many families, finding a connection to the First World War is a rediscovery. So a recent study of the types of public narrative in the centenary found that this very strong cultural memory, which lauded soldiers as victims, and again, we've already seen there's a very nuanced history behind that, effectively blocked diverse understandings of the conflict, which sort of maybe wanted to change public understandings. So the First World War very broadly is remembered as this kind of white, bloody, futile and Western Front-focused war. So it makes us wonder, where are some of the other stories that have perhaps been hidden? And I think there's been some lectures lately in here that have maybe told you about some of the other facets of this. Oh, I'm a slide behind. This has implications for the final set of family donations to museums that happened during the centenary, our final port of call for kind of these major shifting points of donation of First World War family items to museums. During the centenary, this was not, however, a donation of physical objects. Instead, the objects remained in people's houses and digital copies were uploaded to museums' kind of online portals and websites. So in this very final section, we're going to think about two of these collections. The British Jews in the First World War, They Were There Too project, a community-based project from East London, which grew into this national one, and the Imperial War Museums Lives of the First World War, which is a kind of international project, but ended up mostly kind of being more about Britain than the rest of the world. And of course, these are but two of many projects that I'm sure that a lot of you will have seen a few years ago. The British Jews in the First World War site is this lovely community project that's just grown, which sort of began as an effort to capture and record the experiences of Jewish communities in London during the First World War, and particularly the East End of London. Although it's then kind of grown into this national project where people can donate stories of their kind of Jewish family history from elsewhere. So it collects lots of histories of kind of people, of individuals in the First World War, and then marries them with museum collections, all in this kind of online portal. And there was genuine engagement with the project. The people who kind of, again, they donate their family archives by allowing people to take pictures of them, telling their stories, and then that's what's put on the website. People retain their objects in the home. But people were absolutely thrilled with this. So they were particularly relieved that their story now had less of a chance of being lost. So again, this is kind of capturing some of this information that otherwise might not have kind of made it through. The Lives of the First World War was quite similar in some ways, but it's on a bigger scale. So it was launched in May 2014 and was an online attempt to document the lives of all of those involved in the British war effort during the First World War. So the site was kind of populated, so there are 7.7 million individual histories on the website. So the names of most people that they could gather who were involved in some way were kind of already populated, and then you could find, say, your ancestor and then try and add more information about them. So it was a slightly different process. You were adding information to something that had already been scaffolded rather than coming to the project and saying, I have a family history here. And sometimes these family additions to the site reveal a beautiful memorial motive for adding information to a record. So one person briefly told the story of their uncle writing, I know my dad cherished Charlie's memory. The older of my brothers has Charles as a middle name, and Charlie's death penny was always displayed at our family home. And what I found, at least, particularly interesting about these sites is that not only do they provide for the long-term memorialization of the dead, they're doing what all of these collections wanted to do, kind of in 1917, 1918. But they do so with the understanding that objects and memories still remain very important keepsakes within the home. They're kind of taking, it's the best of both worlds in some ways, right? You get to kind of add your item to a museum collection while still getting to keep it. You don't have to make this choice. And what I really love about the British Jews in the First World War project is that they're really explicit about this. So they tell you how to keep your item in kind of the best condition you possibly can. And their website is full of basic curatorial information about how to preserve your items. And it's an absolutely fantastic resource. So instead of regarding the online site as a way of kind of preserving the items through what I've termed digital reincarnation, but I'm not really sure that's the right term, the project instead recognized the inherent kind of value of all of the items that we've looked at today as family objects and helps preserve them for future iterations of the family. So while these sites are undoubtedly of memorial significance for the donors, I do want to briefly think about whose stories are more likely to be on them and whose stories aren't. There have been some really lovely examples of this. So the Welsh experience of the First World War was a crowdsourcing project run by the National Library of Wales. So again, they wanted people to come in to the museum with items that represented the Welsh home front. However, they found that everybody brought them items associated with soldiers from the Western Front instead, and they actually really struggled to find things that were based in Wales and that would tell the story of what was happening in Wales, while obviously everybody kind of was away fighting. In a different study, there was a study of women who were asked to talk about their family history. Again, trying to ask about women's experiences of war. But instead of offering up their women's experiences in the home front, people wanted to talk about their soldiers, which again, absolutely right, of course they should. However, it does mean that it's been harder to get at some of these hidden histories of things that they're elusive in the first place and that they slip away even further to some extent. What I think this points to is that the donation of items by families only really corresponds to war narratives they're familiar with, which means that kind of the collections as a whole are slightly skewed. And I've very much come to some of these digital sites as a researcher, so I'm interested in whose stories are there and whose aren't, and what this means for the practice of using them for our research. So if people's first associations of the First World War, when they're asked about it, are again of kind of white men who fought on the Western Front, these are likely to be the family histories that will be offered to the site, which is of course not to say these histories are valid. They are of course ridiculously important when we're telling the histories of war. However, what it does hide is sometimes that either the home front or the global dimension of war as well. So if we have a look at this in kind of, this is Lives of the First World War again. So if we look at this, what this looks like on the kind of collection site, here, while the names of Black, South Asian and East Asian men who served during the war are featured on the site, their kind of stories and additional evidence are completely, there's nothing there. Families have not uploaded anything. Now, whether that's because families don't have histories of their family member, or whether that's because they don't feel like this site is for them, or whether, again, because they thought that it was largely about kind of the Western Front or something, we're unsure of. But we can see it kind of quite starkly represented here when there's none of that additional evidence. So whole swathes of combatants, so support troops, auxiliary workers and nursing personnel, have to some extent had their role in history reduced through this. So due to a lack of formal memorial items, the remembrance of people who have not been traditionally recognised as equal wartime actors are still sometimes hidden in these online collections. It's quite interesting taking a critical look at what we can think of when we look at them as a whole, which is particularly kind of starkly visible comment on, I think, whose stories are less likely to be remembered. And it's, again, as somebody who kind of works as an academic and museum professional, it's always worth keeping an eye on that, right? What are the collections that are being built? Because that has implications for how people use these museums to tell future histories. But what these sites do more broadly is to allow families to show their link to the First World War on a global platform. So far from a hidden act that the donation of family items to a museum often constitutes, right? It's normally hidden. We don't hear much about why an item is in the museum. It's not on public display. This kind of thing is very, very visible and very public. They're done on public platforms which are designed to act as both a digital memorial and as a space to people to research the effects of war. So in many ways, the Imperial War Museums collection in particular realises some of those original purposes of the Bond of Sacrifice collection, which again we examined in the first third of this talk, to create this very large public memorial to the war dead that could be seen. It is globally visible, although it of course isn't physically visible. Those who served in the war had a public memorial which helped personalise those who've been involved in the war, which in many cases involved the online display of photographs submitted by their families. And there's something really lovely about these sites and what they've managed to do. For families, there was a clear drive to add these kind of digital memorials, fulfilling a need to mark their ancestor as part of the conflict. These online memorials, however, are relatively new. And I think it's going to be absolutely fascinating to see how they develop over the coming years and decades. How will successive generations of families react to their ancestors' history being so publicly displayed on the web? Will it strengthen family remembrances? Or will people not actually know that their ancestors are commemorated in this way? Will we have a lot of family splits again? These are not static items stored in a physical location, but instead these are digital ones. How will they influence the histories of war and the stories that we are able to tell? As physical items are at risk of degradation and the need of the intervention of professional conservators to keep them stable, how long will these digital items resist the march of time? What needs to be done to preserve them as well is a very real question. And will they outlast the stories that families tell behind closed doors about their First World War ancestors. So 111 years after the outbreak of the First World War, we're talking about how people lived through and the families of those who died placed their memories into museums to be held for posterity. Wary of how histories of individuals can get lost within families, people gave them to museums that they felt would value their contributions, and of course they do, we do. Why they did this varied. Some did it because they thought family members weren't interested in keeping these histories. Other people did it to get some sense of closure, or because they simply felt that museums would be the right place for their First World War objects. People very generously explained this to the curators, leaving traces of what this act meant to them and the legacy that they wanted to secure for their loved ones, that their memory would not be lost. And that, I think, so many of them have been included in this talk, speaks to their success. Thank you very much.